Hello everybody, thank you for tuning in. So today we are going to be discussing cholesterol. We'll talk about the basic structure of cholesterol, why it's important to human physiology. We'll look at where it comes from and how it's used by the body for many necessary functions. However, in this video, I'm not going to be discussing the specific mechanisms of atherosclerosis, nor will I mention specifically what cardiovascular disease is and how we treat it. I will briefly mention how cholesterol contributes to cardiovascular disease, but the focus of today's topic is really just to sort of introduce cholesterol and give you a better understanding of how it's vital to everyday life and really cellular life itself. Okay, now let's look at the structure of cholesterol. So you'll notice here on the left, cholesterol has three 6-carbon rings, it has a 5-carbon ring, and then a few side chains. Now, that's important because this makes cholesterol a lipid. It's a fat, and that means chemically it is non-polar. Now, you may recognize an image like this where you have water and oil that are separating. Now, this happens because water, H2O, which is polar, only dissolves other polar molecules. Like dissolves like. Now, on the other hand, oil or fats or lipids such as cholesterol is nonpolar. So if you put the two together, they're going to separate. Now this is important in the human body because cholesterol, again being nonpolar, it has to be transported to basically every organ and tissue in the body that needs it. But how can it do that if the bloodstream or circulatory system, being our primary highway of the body, is mostly comprised of water? If they don't mix, how can you get cholesterol to those tissues that need it? And we'll answer that in just a few moments. Okay, now let's talk about the first major function of cholesterol. So you may recognize, if you've ever taken a general biology course, this picture up here in the left corner is a two-dimensional representation of a cell. So you may remember here in the middle is typically the nucleus. And then there are a lot of other organelles like ribosomes, mitochondria that fill up this space around the nucleus. And on the outside of the cell is sort of this capsule or casing known as the cell membrane. Now, if we take a closer look at the cell membrane, you'll notice first of all that it's fluid. It's not a rigid spherical shape. And this is important because cells need to be able to bend and move around other objects. And if we think about red blood cells that are traveling all throughout our body, throughout the bloodstream, they need to be able to be flexible to move in and out of capillary spaces and travel throughout the bloodstream. Now, part of this function of cell membrane fluidity is due to the fact that there is cholesterol within the cell membrane. So you may remember that most cell membranes have a phospholipid bilayer, that are these red circles here. They're phospholipids that sort of face inwards at each other. And then there are a lot of other proteins and fats that span the cell membrane. They're used as transporters. They're different enzymes that allow certain molecules in and keep certain molecules out. Now, cholesterol, which makes up about a quarter or 20-25% of all the lipids in the cell membrane, is what gives the cell its fluidity and sort of flexible shape. And that's crucial, not just for red blood cells, but almost every cell depends on this sort of fluidity for it to function properly. Now, there are inherited defects or genetic defects in which a sort of change in this cholesterol ratio, where there's less cholesterol in the membrane, will lead to more rigid blood cells, red blood cells. And this can cause complications where the red blood cells can no longer pass through capillaries and you are essentially depriving your tissues of oxygen. So the first major function of cholesterol is to give cells their shape and their fluid function. Now, cholesterol doesn't only have structural functions. Cholesterol serves as the precursor for many of the hormones that you may be familiar with. So if you remember the molecule I showed you earlier, the sort of chemical structure of cholesterol, the 3 6-carbon rings, the 5-carbon ring, and then some of these little side chains. Well, notice cortisol, testosterone, and estradiol or estrogen all look really similar to cholesterol, and that's because these hormones are derived from cholesterol. So cholesterol is the precursor for all of the major steroid hormones that are produced by both the adrenal cortex and the gonads. So if we look at the adrenal glands, particularly the adrenal cortex, some of these hormones like cortisol, aldosterone, and you may know that the adrenal glands are also responsible for producing some percentage of testosterone and estrogen. They all come from cholesterol. And in the gonads, or our sex organs, you have, again, a lot of the major steroid hormones: estrogen, testosterone, DHT, which is a derivative of testosterone, are all synthesized from cholesterol. So without cholesterol, you don't have any of these major hormones that are essential not only to our day-to-day function, but really for our vitality and way of life. Okay, the next major function of cholesterol is that it is also used by the liver to synthesize bile salts. Now, bile salts are released into the small intestine during digestion, and they essentially they emulsify fats. So what that means is when we consume fats in our diet, so they come in it. This is our small intestine up here. They come into the small intestine in the form of triglycerides, and the bile salts come in and they sort of wrap around these triglycerides. They make it easier for lipase enzymes to come in and break them apart. Now, when they're broken apart into smaller molecules like fatty acids and monoglycerides, they are then able to be readily absorbed through the small intestine wall, and then our body can repackage them, use them. They typically ship them out as chylomicrons, and then they travel through the lymphatic system into the venous system, and our body can use them as needed. But what's important is that without bile salts, which again is derived from cholesterol, our body really could not absorb fat that well, and we'd be missing out on a major component of our diet, and we would kind of be nutrition deprived of a lot of the necessary fats. Okay, now let's talk about the lipoprotein. So you may have seen a diagram like this before. You may be familiar with this language of LDL, or low density lipoprotein, is often referred to as bad cholesterol, and HDL is often referred to as good cholesterol. So you may have understood that you typically want to lower your LDL cholesterol and raise your HDL cholesterol, and that is often associated with better cardiovascular health. Well, I want to sort of convince you that that language of bad and good cholesterol is not necessarily accurate, and it's quite wrong. Again, I'm not going to get into the semantics of LDL cholesterol, HDL cholesterol, how they work, or how they contribute to cardiovascular disease. Generally, LDL cholesterol will sort of deposit its cholesterol components into the arterial wall, and we'll look at another diagram that shows that in just a moment. But and that forms plaques and atherosclerosis, and eventually can clog an artery. And it's thought that HDL will take some of that cholesterol out of the arterial wall and bring it back to the liver. Well, I want to show you that the cholesterol that is associated with LDL is the same cholesterol associated with HDL. There's no good or bad cholesterol. So here we have a lipoprotein. So as I mentioned before, there are high density lipoproteins and low density lipoproteins. There are other lipoproteins like very low density lipoproteins and some other remnant cells, but what is important here is that the lipoprotein, it sort of looks like a cell where there is a cell membrane and then a lot of organelles and components inside of it. And that's kind of how you should think of it, is that a lipoprotein has these phospholipids on the outside with some proteins associated with it, polypeptides. And these are the apolipoproteins. And I'm not going to talk about the specific apolipoproteins today, But what's important is these lipoproteins contain triglycerides and cholesterol inside of them. And there are typically two major classes. There are higher density lipoproteins and lower density lipoproteins. And they're called this because if you look at them individually, you'll notice that the higher density lipoproteins have a higher proportion of protein compared to cholesterol. They're smaller in size. And so if we consider that density is typically calculated by mass divided by volume, the higher density molecules are going to have more mass, more proteins, and a smaller volume. Low density lipoproteins, on the other hand, are going to typically contain much more cholesterol. They have less proteins surrounding them compared to cholesterol. So proportional to the higher density lipoproteins, they are larger in size and carry more cholesterol. Now, why do I mention those things? Because these, as I mentioned before, the lipoproteins are those molecules that carry cholesterol through the bloodstream. So if you remember me mentioning that cholesterol is a lipid, it's nonpolar, so it doesn't dissolve in water. Well, protein can interact and it is soluble in water. So if we create a sort of like a vehicle, a car that cholesterol can be transported in, and this car is surrounded by both fat and protein, the car can move freely, or this lipoprotein can move freely throughout the bloodstream, and cholesterol is sort of hidden inside of it. So that's why HDL and LDL are important, because their main role is to transport special cargo like cholesterol and triglycerides that couldn't go through the bloodstream on their own. There are just two distinct classes of lipoproteins, but why I say there aren't good and bad cholesterol associated with this is that they both carry the same type of cholesterol. There aren't different cholesterol types where some are good and some are bad. Some cholesterol is good for your health, and then other cholesterol, the bad cholesterol, causes cardiovascular disease. That's just not true. These molecules, LDL and HDL molecules, they have different tendencies and they interact with the arteries in different ways. And we'll make a video on that later on. But for now, I want you to understand that the cholesterol that is in the LDL molecule is exactly the same as the cholesterol that is found in the HDL molecule. There is no good and bad cholesterol. As I mentioned before, cholesterol is vital to cellular life. And every organ and tissue in our body needs cholesterol. And so these lipoproteins are able to transport them throughout the bloodstream. So in summary, we really talked about three main functions of cholesterol in the human body. The first one being membrane fluidity. It's present in basically every cell membrane, and it gives it that flexible fluid shape so that the cell can function properly. It's not a rigid sphere, but it moves, it's flexible. Then we talked about how cholesterol, we looked at its chemical structure and how different tissues like the adrenal glands and the gonads or sex organs like ovaries and testes can use cholesterol to synthesize extremely important steroid hormones like cortisol, testosterone, estradiol. Then we looked at how the liver can use cholesterol to create bile salts, and bile salts are important for overall digestion, but specifically for fat emulsification, so that we can metabolize and really absorb fat from our intestine. And I just, as a reminder, we really should stop using the words good and bad cholesterol. All the cholesterol we see in those lipoproteins are the same. Again, cholesterol is totally vital to life itself, and sometimes the connotations of bad cholesterol just inaccurately describes what we're looking at. And we'll make a future video on cardiovascular disease, and we'll look at what that actually means for cholesterol to be bad and how it leads to different types of cardiovascular disease. But for now, I hope I did a good job at highlighting the importance of cholesterol and hopefully giving you a little bit of a better insight of why it's vital to cellular life. Alright, so if you made it this far in the video, thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed today's content and learned a few things about cholesterol. If you did, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel if you want to see more medical related and healthcare topics. Comment down below what topics you want to see, and I will try and make videos on those as soon as I can. And on that note, I hope you have a great day, and I'll catch you next time.